The emergency lights cast an eerie red glow through the corridors of the Earth Wildlife Research Center, their rhythmic pulsing creating dancing shadows on the metallic walls. Cameron Hayes pressed his back against the cold surface, his breath coming in short, controlled bursts as he listened for any sound of movement. The creature he had been tracking for the past 3 hours was somewhere in this section of the facility, and every instinct honed through years of studying animal behavior told him it was close. Cameron was not your typical research scientist. At 32, he had already established himself as one of the foremost experts in animal behavior and interspecies communication. His unconventional methods often raised eyebrows among his colleagues, but his results spoke for themselves. Where others saw dangerous predators, Cameron saw complex behavioral patterns and communication systems waiting to be understood. The facility around him represented humanity's latest attempt to catalog and understand the most dangerous species that had once roamed Earth before the Great Extinction Protocol had been implemented. Tonight, however, something had gone terribly wrong. The containment systems had failed, and one of the most lethal specimens had escaped its enclosure. A low, guttural sound echoed through the hallway, followed by the distinctive scraping of claws against metal. Cameron's assistant Martinez had evacuated with the rest of the staff, but Cameron had refused to leave. Not when there was a chance to observe this creature's behavior in an uncontrolled environment. It was an opportunity that might never come again. The sound grew closer, and Cameron could hear the creature's heavy breathing. He had studied the files extensively, knew that this particular specimen possessed intelligence far beyond what conventional science had previously attributed to its species. As the creature rounded the corner, Cameron found himself face to face with 8 feet of pure predatory power. Its eyes, a deep amber color, fixed on him with an intelligence that sent a chill down his spine. Instead of running or reaching for the tranquilizer gun at his belt, Cameron did something that would have seemed insane to any observer. He slowly lowered himself into a submissive crouch, his eyes never leaving the creature's face, and began to emit a low, rhythmic humming sound. The technique was based on years of research into predator-prey dynamics and the subtle ways that submission could be communicated across species barriers. The creature paused, its head tilting slightly as it processed this unexpected response. For a moment that stretched into eternity, predator and human regarded each other in silence. Then, impossibly, the creature's aggressive posture began to relax. The tension in its muscles eased, and it lowered its head in what Cameron recognized as a gesture of acknowledgement. The moment of triumph was shattered by the sudden appearance of armored figures materializing through the walls themselves. The Draconid warriors moved with fluid precision, their advanced technology allowing them to phase through solid matter as if it were air. Cameron barely had time to register their presence before a stunning beam rendered him unconscious. When consciousness returned, Cameron found himself in a vast chamber that defied every law of physics he understood. The walls seemed to pulse with their own internal light, and the air itself hummed with energy that made his skin tingle. He was no longer on Earth, of that he was certain. The gravity felt different, lighter somehow, and the very architecture around him spoke of a civilization that had mastered technologies humanity could barely imagine. Standing before him was a figure that commanded attention through sheer presence alone. Queen Elixa of the Draconid Empire was tall and regal, her scales shifting through subtle variations of deep blue and silver as the light played across her form. Her eyes, large and multifaceted, like precious gems, regarded Cameron with an intensity that seemed to peer directly into his soul. She wore robes that seemed to be woven from starlight itself, and a crown that appeared to be carved from a single, massive crystal. "You are the one who spoke to the sacred beast," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated in frequencies Cameron had never heard before. "Our ancient prophecies speak of such a being, one who can communicate with the wild things, who understands the language that transcends species." Cameron struggled to process what he was hearing. Ancient prophecies. Sacred beasts. The creature he had encountered was apparently far more significant than he had ever imagined. As Queen Elixa continued to speak, Cameron learned that the Draconid Empire had been searching for someone like him for generations. Their military conquests across the galaxy were driven not by mere expansion, but by a desperate search for the prophesied beast speaker, who would be able to command their most sacred creature, Vorax. "Our empire has conquered 1,000 worlds," Elixa explained, her voice carrying both pride and something that might have been regret. "But Vorax has never acknowledged any of our warriors or scholars. The prophecy states that only the true beast speaker can earn its obedience, and when that day comes, our empire will enter a new age." Cameron was led through corridors that seemed to stretch for miles, past chambers containing wonders that would have revolutionized human understanding of science and technology. Floating gardens defied gravity, their alien plants reaching toward artificial suns that burned with perfect controlled fusion. Laboratories contained specimens from dozens of worlds, each one a testament to the Draconid Empire's vast reach across the galaxy. But it was the arena that truly took Cameron's breath away. The Chamber of Kravoth was a massive amphitheater carved from living rock, its walls rising hundreds of feet toward a ceiling that seemed to open directly onto the stars. Ancient symbols covered every surface, their meaning lost to all but the most learned scholars. This was where Cameron would face the 3 trials that would determine whether he was truly the beast speaker of prophecy. Captain Vane, the Draconid warrior who had captured Cameron, stood at attention beside the Queen's throne. His expression was one of barely concealed skepticism. "My Queen," he said, his voice respectful but firm, "this human is soft-weak. He has never faced true combat. How can he possibly succeed where our greatest warriors have failed?" The first trial began without ceremony. The arena floor shifted and moved, revealing a creature that made the specimen from Earth seem tame by comparison. The Krakenoid was a mass of writhing tentacles and snapping beaks, each tentacle capable of crushing stone. Its intelligence was alien and hostile, and it had been bred specifically to test warriors in mortal combat. Cameron's heart hammered in his chest as the creature advanced, but he forced himself to observe, rather than simply react. The Krakenoid's movements followed patterns, just like every other predator he had studied. Its tentacles moved in specific sequences, and its attacks were preceded by subtle changes in posture and coloration. Most importantly, Cameron noticed that it paused between attacks as if waiting for something. Instead of fighting, Cameron began to mirror the creature's movements. When it raised its tentacles in an aggressive display, Cameron raised his arms in response. When it shifted its weight, Cameron shifted his own stance accordingly. Slowly, gradually, the creature's attacks became less frenzied, more ritualized. Cameron had recognized that this was not simply a test of combat prowess, but a test of communication. The Krakenoid was trying to establish dominance through display, rather than actual violence. When Cameron finally lowered himself into a submissive posture, while maintaining eye contact, the Krakenoid's entire demeanor changed. It approached cautiously, its tentacles, now moving in gentle exploratory gestures. It touched Cameron's outstretched hand with what could only be described as curiosity, and then, incredibly, it settled into a resting position that left Cameron unharmed. The crowd of Draconid observers erupted in amazed chatter. Never before had anyone survived the first trial without weapons or armor. Queen Elixa leaned forward in her throne, her multifaceted eyes fixed on Cameron with new interest. The second trial transported Cameron into a maze of crystalline walls that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. This was the labyrinth of whispers, where the very air could drive lesser beings to madness, with its constant murmuring of alien thoughts and forgotten secrets. Hidden within the maze were assassins, creatures bred for stealth, and killing programmed to hunt anyone who entered their domain. Cameron quickly realized that traditional navigation would be useless in this environment. Instead, he closed his eyes and listened. Beneath the maddening whispers, He could detect the subtle sounds of movement, the barely perceptible displacement of air that indicated a predator's presence. More importantly, he began to understand that the whispers themselves were not random. They were a form of communication, a way for the maze's guardians to coordinate their movements. By learning to interpret these whispers, Cameron was able to predict where the assassins would strike. He moved through the maze not by fighting or hiding, but by positioning himself where the whispers indicated he would be safe. It was a delicate dance of prediction and movement, requiring him to trust completely in his ability to understand the alien communication system. When he finally emerged from the maze unharmed, the Draconid observers fell silent. The trials of Kravoth had stood for 1,000 years, and no one had ever completed even 2 of them using methods like these. The third trial was the most crucial. Cameron was led to a chamber containing a juvenile Vorax, a creature no larger than a house cat, but possessing intelligence that seemed almost supernatural. The young beast regarded Cameron with eyes that held depths of understanding that made him uncomfortable. This was not simply about communication or survival. This was about earning trust from a being that could see directly into his soul. Cameron spent hours with the young Vorax, not trying to dominate or control it, but simply trying to understand. He observed its play behaviors, its feeding patterns, the way it interacted with its environment. Gradually, he began to recognize the subtle signs of its emotional states, the way its scales shifted color to indicate curiosity, contentment, or wariness. The breakthrough came when Cameron realized that the young Vorax was not just intelligent but empathic. It could sense emotions and intentions with supernatural accuracy. Instead of trying to hide his fear and uncertainty, Cameron opened himself completely, allowing the creature to sense his genuine desire to understand and protect, rather than to dominate. The moment of connection was unlike anything Cameron had ever experienced. It was as if a bridge had been built between 2 completely different forms of consciousness, allowing them to share not just thoughts, but emotions and intentions. The young Vorax approached him without fear, nuzzling against his hand with complete trust. The trials were complete, but Cameron's real challenges were only beginning. As word of his success spread through the Draconid court, he became aware of undercurrents of political intrigue that ran deeper than the ocean trenches of his homeworld. Not everyone was pleased that an alien had succeeded where Draconid warriors had failed. Dresnar, the Queen's chief advisor, was a master of court politics and ancient tradition. He had spent decades consolidating power by positioning himself as the guardian of Draconid culture and military supremacy. The emergence of a human beast speaker threatened everything he had worked to build. If the ancient prophecies were true, it would mean fundamental changes to the Empire's entire approach to conquest and expansion. "My queen," Dresnar said during a private audience, his voice smooth and carefully modulated. "While this human's abilities are impressive, we must consider the implications. Our empire was built on strength and conquest. Our people understand and respect power. To suddenly change course based on ancient myths could be seen as weakness." Queen Elixa had been experiencing her own internal struggles. The success of the human had forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about her empire's methods. She had inherited a civilization built on military conquest, but she had also inherited the ancient prophecies that spoke of a different path. Watching Cameron succeed through understanding, rather than domination, had awakened something in her that she had long suppressed. "The prophecies are not myths, Dresnar," she replied, her voice carrying an edge of authority that brooked no argument. "They are the foundation of our civilization. If this human truly is the beast speaker, then we must consider what that means for our future." Dresnar bowed respectfully, but behind his deferential manner, plans were already forming. He had not risen to his position of power by accepting defeat gracefully. If direct opposition would not work, then perhaps more subtle methods were required. As Cameron spent more time in the Draconid court, he began to understand the complex social and political structures that governed this advanced civilization. The Draconid Empire was not simply a military conquest machine, but a sophisticated society with art philosophy and scientific achievements that dwarfed anything humanity had accomplished. Yet it was also a society trapped by its own traditions, locked into patterns of behavior that might once have been necessary for survival, but had become destructive in their current form. Queen Elixa began to spend increasing amounts of time with Cameron, ostensibly to learn more about his abilities and their implications for the Empire. But as days turned into weeks, their conversations ranged far beyond matters of policy and prophecy. They spoke of their respective worlds, their hopes and fears, their visions of what the future might hold. Cameron found himself drawn to Elixa's intelligence and complexity. Beneath her regal exterior was a brilliant mind grappling with impossible choices. She was a leader, trying to balance the expectations of her people with her own growing conviction that the Empire's current path was unsustainable. Her scales would shift to softer hues when she spoke of her dreams for a different kind of future, one built on cooperation rather than conquest. For Elixa, Cameron represented something she had never encountered before: someone who achieved power through understanding rather than force. His methods challenged everything she had been taught about leadership and strength, yet they were undeniably effective. More than that, his presence awakened emotions she had thought herself incapable of feeling. Their growing connection did not go unnoticed by Dresner and his allies. The advisor watched with growing alarm as the Queen's attitudes began to shift. She started questioning military strategies that had been successful for generations, asking uncomfortable questions about the long-term consequences of conquest, even suggesting that some worlds might be approached through diplomacy rather than force. Dresner's solution was elegant in its simplicity and monstrous in its implications. The Queen had been experiencing periodic episodes of weakness and disorientation symptoms that he had attributed to the stress of leadership. In reality, he had been slowly poisoning her with a substance that would gradually weaken her until she was forced to rely completely on his guidance. With the Queen dependent on him, and the troublesome human discredited or eliminated, Dresner could continue the Empire's traditional policies without interference. The poison was derived from a rare plant found only in the sacred caverns beneath the capital city. It was virtually undetectable, its effects mimicking natural illness, and it had the additional advantage of being reversible if the correct antidote was administered. Dresner's plan was to position himself as the Queen's savior, while ensuring that she remained dependent on his continued support. Cameron first noticed something was wrong when Elixa began experiencing dizzy spells during their conversations. Her scales, which normally shifted through vibrant colors as her emotions changed, began to fade to dull grays and browns. Her speech became slower, less precise, and she complained of persistent headaches that no Draconid physician could explain. Dr. Nadia Krell, the court's chief physician, was baffled by the Queen's condition. All conventional tests showed nothing abnormal, yet the Queen's health continued to deteriorate. When Cameron suggested that the symptoms might indicate poisoning, Dr. Krell was initially skeptical, but she agreed to run more specialized tests. The results confirmed Cameron's suspicions. The Queen was indeed being poisoned, but the substance was so exotic that identifying the specific toxin would require extensive research. More urgently, the Queen's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Without immediate treatment, she would soon be too weak to fulfill her duties as ruler, exactly the situation that would allow Dresner to assume effective control of the Empire. Cameron's investigation led him to the court scholar Sarinthal, an ancient Draconid who maintained the Empire's historical records and knowledge of traditional medicine. Sarinthal had served several previous rulers and possessed knowledge that spanned centuries of Draconid history. "The symptoms you describe," Sarinthal said after Cameron had explained the situation, "match those caused by the Whisper of Shadows, a poison derived from plants that grow in our most sacred caverns. It was used in ancient times by those who sought to control rulers through apparent illness. The antidote, according to Serenthal's records, could only be found in the same sacred caverns where the poison plant grew. But the caverns were considered forbidden territory, protected by both ancient taboos and very real dangers. The caves were home to creatures that had never been fully catalogued, and the cavern system itself was notoriously unstable. "I must go," Cameron declared when he learned of the Queen's worsening condition. "I'm the only one who might be able to communicate with whatever creatures guard those caverns." Elixa, despite her weakness, insisted on accompanying him. "If the prophecies are true," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "then this is part of the path we must walk together. I will not hide in safety while others risk their lives for my sake." The journey to the sacred caverns took them deep beneath the Draconid capital, through passages that had been carved from living rock millions of years ago. The walls were covered with phosphorescent fungi that provided an eerie blue-green illumination, and the air grew thicker and more humid as they descended. Cameron supported Elixa as they made their way through the tunnels, her condition continuing to deteriorate with each passing hour. He could see the effort it cost her to continue, but her determination never wavered. This was her empire, her people, and she would not abandon her responsibilities, even in the face of death. The sacred caverns themselves were a wonder that took Cameron's breath away. Vast chambers stretched beyond the reach of their lights, their walls covered with formations of crystal that sang with harmonics when the wind passed through them. Underground rivers flowed through channels carved from solid rock, their waters glowing with bioluminescent organisms that had never seen the light of a star. But it was the plants that drew Cameron's attention. The whisper of shadows grew in clusters around thermal vents, their dark purple leaves seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. Near them, in a formation that suggested symbiosis rather than competition, grew other plants whose leaves glowed with their own internal light. These had to be the source of the antidote. As Cameron approached the glowing plants, the cavern around them erupted into motion. Creatures that had remained perfectly camouflaged against the rock walls suddenly revealed themselves, moving to block his path. They were unlike anything in his experience, beings that seemed to be part plant and part animal, their forms shifting and flowing like living liquid. But instead of attacking the creatures, seemed to be testing him. They moved in patterns that reminded Cameron of the trials he had faced in the arena, not seeking to harm, but to communicate. Using the techniques he had learned with Vorax, Cameron began to respond to their movements, gradually establishing a dialogue through gesture and position. The creatures were the guardians of the sacred plants, beings that had evolved to protect the delicate balance of the cavern ecosystem. They were intelligent enough to understand that Cameron and Elixa were in desperate need, but they were also bound by ancient instincts to protect their charges from exploitation. The negotiation was conducted entirely through movement and touch, a dance of communication that required Cameron to demonstrate not just his need, but his respect for the creatures and their environment. He showed them Elixa's weakening condition, allowed them to sense his genuine love and concern for her, and gradually made them understand that he sought to heal rather than to exploit. When the Guardians finally granted permission, Cameron carefully harvested only what was needed for the antidote, following the precise instructions that Serenthal had provided. The glowing plants yielded a sap that seemed to contain concentrated starlight, warm to the touch and humming with energy. The healing process was immediate and dramatic. As soon as the antidote touched Elixa's lips, color began to return to her scales. Her breathing deepened, her eyes cleared, and strength flowed back into her limbs. Within hours, she was completely recovered, her body purged of the poison that had been slowly killing her. But their moment of triumph was shattered by the arrival of Dresner and a squad of loyal guards. The advisor had followed them to the caverns, bringing with him warriors who were still loyal to the old ways and suspicious of the changes that Cameron's presence had brought to their empire. "My queen," Dresner said, his voice dripping with false concern. You should not have risked yourself in these dangerous places. Your illness has clearly affected your judgment. Return with me to the palace, and we will ensure that you receive proper care." It was then that the cavern shook with a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. Vorax had come. The great sacred beast materialized from the shadows, like a force of nature given form. It was massive beyond Cameron's imagining, its scales shifting through colors that had no names, its eyes holding intelligence that spanned eons. Dresner's guards raised their weapons, but Vorax paid them no attention. Its gaze was fixed entirely on Cameron, and in that gaze was a question that transcended species and language. The creature was asking whether Cameron was truly worthy of the trust that the ancient prophecies had promised. Cameron stepped forward, every instinct screaming at him to run or hide. But he had learned that true communication required courage as much as understanding. He reached out with his mind as he had with the young Vorax, opening himself completely to the great creature's examination. What passed between them was beyond words or images. It was a sharing of souls, a moment of perfect understanding between two beings who were separated by biology, but united by something deeper. Vorax saw into Cameron's heart and found there no desire for power or domination, only a genuine love for all living things and a desperate hope for peace between worlds. When Vorax lowered its great head in acknowledgement, the political landscape of the Draconid Empire changed forever. The ancient prophecies had been fulfilled, and everyone present understood the implications. Dresner's conspiracy collapsed as his guards, faced with undeniable proof of Cameron's legitimacy, refused to follow orders that contradicted their most sacred beliefs. The advisor's arrest revealed the full extent of his manipulations. Documents hidden in his chambers showed plans that went far beyond poisoning the Queen. He had been preparing to assume emergency powers to declare the Queen unfit to rule and to return the Empire to its most aggressive expansionist policies. His vision of the future involved conquering Earth and enslaving humanity, using their world's resources to fuel further military campaigns. The trial of Dresner became a turning point for the entire Empire. As evidence of his crimes was presented, it became clear that the Empire's traditional policies had been corrupted by individuals who sought personal power rather than the good of their people. The Draconid Empire had forgotten its own ancient wisdom in pursuit of endless conquest. Queen Elixa used the trial as an opportunity to announce a fundamental shift in imperial policy. "We have conquered 1,000 worlds," she declared to the assembled court. "But what have we truly gained? Our people live in constant warfare. Our resources are stretched across impossible distances, and we have made enemies of every species we have encountered. The prophecies spoke of a new age, and that age begins now." Cameron was formally appointed as Royal Advisor for Interspecies Relations, a position that had never existed before, but that everyone recognized as necessary for the Empire's new direction. His first act was to propose a peaceful diplomatic mission to Earth, offering to share Draconid technology and knowledge in exchange for partnership rather than demanding submission. The decision was not universally popular. Many Draconid military leaders questioned whether their people would accept such a dramatic change in direction. Generations of warriors had been raised on stories of glorious conquest, and the idea of seeking partnership with species they had previously viewed as inferior was difficult to accept. But Vorax's acceptance of Cameron had given the new policies a legitimacy that could not be questioned. The great creature's approval was seen as divine endorsement, and even the most conservative elements of Draconid society found it difficult to argue against the fulfillment of ancient prophecy. The changes were not immediate or easy. Centuries of military tradition could not be overturned overnight, and there were many within the Empire who worked to undermine the new policies. But Cameron's presence provided a constant reminder of what was possible when understanding replaced force as the primary tool of diplomacy. Elixa and Cameron's relationship deepened beyond mere political alliance. Their shared experiences in the sacred caverns had created a bond that transcended species differences. They complemented each other perfectly, her understanding of power and politics balanced by his knowledge of communication and empathy, his human perspective enriched by her alien wisdom. Their love affair was unprecedented in Draconid history. Never before had a monarch formed a romantic attachment with a member of another species, and the implications sent ripples throughout the Empire's social structure. But their relationship also served as a powerful symbol of the new age they were trying to create, proof that cooperation and understanding could bridge any gap. The diplomatic mission to Earth was planned with extraordinary care. Cameron worked with teams of Draconid scholars and engineers to develop communication protocols that would allow meaningful dialogue between the two species. The goal was not conquest or even trade, but genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared goals. When Queen Elixa announced her intention to personally lead the diplomatic mission, it sent shockwaves through both the Draconid Empire and Earth's governments. Never before had a Draconid ruler visited another world for peaceful purposes. The very concept challenged fundamental assumptions about how interstellar relations should be conducted. The preparation for the mission took months, during which Cameron served as a bridge between two very different ways of thinking. Earth's governments were skeptical and fearful, expecting some form of deception or hidden agenda. The Draconid military establishment was equally suspicious, viewing the mission as potentially weakening their strategic position. But Cameron's reputation on both worlds gave the mission credibility it would not otherwise have possessed. His success in the trials of Kravoth had made him a legend among the Draconids, while his Earth origins made him a trusted advocate for human interests. His presence guaranteed that both sides would at least listen to what the other had to say. As the great Draconid diplomatic vessel prepared for departure, Vorax made an unprecedented decision. The sacred beast, which had never before left the Draconid homeworld, chose to accompany the mission. Its presence was interpreted as the ultimate blessing for the new age of cooperation. The launch ceremony was attended by representatives from across the Draconid Empire. As the ship lifted into space, carrying its precious cargo of hope and possibility, the assembled crowds fell silent. They were witnessing the beginning of something entirely new in their history, and everyone understood the magnitude of the moment. Cameron stood beside Elixa on the ship's observation deck, watching their homeworld shrink behind them. "Are you certain about this?" he asked, knowing the enormous risks they were both taking. Failure could mean the end of their dreams for peace, and the return of the Empire to its old ways of conquest and domination. Elixa's scales shifted to warm gold and silver hues as she considered his question. "The ancient prophecies speak of change, but they do not guarantee success," she replied. "They only promise that the opportunity will come. Whether we succeed or fail depends on our courage to embrace that opportunity." As their ship set course for Earth, Vorax settled into the specially prepared chamber that had been constructed for its comfort. The great creature's presence served as a constant reminder of the sacred nature of their mission. They were not just seeking political alliance, but attempting to fulfill prophecies that were older than either of their civilizations. The journey to Earth would take several weeks' time that Cameron and Elixa used to finalize their proposals and prepare for every possible reaction from Earth's governments. They developed detailed plans for technology-sharing cultural exchange programs and joint scientific expeditions that could benefit both species. But perhaps most importantly, they used the time to deepen their own relationship and understanding. Their love had become the foundation for everything they hoped to achieve, proof that beings from different worlds could find common ground through empathy and respect. As Earth grew larger in their viewports, Cameron reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him to this moment. It had begun with a simple encounter with an escaped creature in a research facility, but it had led to the fulfillment of ancient prophecies and the possibility of peace between civilizations. The future remained uncertain. There would be those on both worlds who opposed the changes they represented, who preferred the familiar patterns of conflict and domination. But for the first time in generations, there was genuine hope for something better. When the Draconid diplomatic vessel entered Earth's solar system, it was met by a fleet of human ships that had been hastily assembled to welcome or, if necessary, defend against the visitors. The tension was palpable, but Cameron's voice over the communication channels provided the reassurance that both sides needed. "This is Cameron Hayes." He broadcast to both fleets, speaking for Queen Elixa of the Draconid Empire and the sacred beast Vorax. "We come not as conquerors, but as partners. We come not to demand submission, but to offer cooperation. We come not to end one age, but to begin another." As the two fleets merged into a single formation and began the journey toward Earth, Cameron knew that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. But they had already achieved something that many had thought impossible. They had proven that understanding could triumph over force, that love could bridge any gap, and that the future could be shaped by hope rather than fear. The age of conquest was ending. The age of alliance had begun.